Good evening. They are everywhere. Non-human bipeds. They come from the sky, they come out of the sea. Some simply roam the land. They come in all sorts of varieties. Some waddle about, while others have uncannily long legs, while there are some that are even human-sized, with the largest towering over humans. Most stand much smaller than a meter, however. But in times before history, there were many giants among them. They are all living bipeds who communicate using all sorts of strange sounds. Some even abduct creatures from the earth. Those of one kind, who live all over the world, have pale, saucer-esque faces with giant black eyes, and they screech in the night as they carry their victims away into the sky. According to legend, even infants and small children are sometimes spirited away by the larger flying raptors. Perhaps this was more true in times past, but what we know for sure is that they are objectively real. And this means they must have minds and experiences, something like our own. And they are everywhere. They live amongst us, and they live in the sky. Living, suffering, raising their young. They're called the avians, and they are literally dinosaurs that can fly. Some even live in the high branches of trees. They evolved this ability in the Earth's deeply ancient past, and they are distantly related to us. Why, sometimes I watch the little people in black, flying below the clouds towards the river, in great crowds from every district. It's their nightly commute, and it happens every sunset. That piece of a fender I saw on the road? It turns out it's the best physical evidence of nuts and bolts flying saucers. And, unfortunately, I had planned to do a whole piece on sulfur, but then I decided it wasn't ready. So instead, tonight's secret word is sulfur. So every time you hear the word sulfur, go beep, just like that. Plus earthquake lights. Were they created by that legendary monster of the Old West, the pasty-faced butthole man, old Elon Musk? All this and more tonight. I'm Rachel Nelson.
I'm Luis Cayetano.
I am muted. I am Jeff Knox.
Welcome to UFO Sunset.
Okay.
And now for the rebrief. A giant mysterious wall of acid sometimes flies across the Venusian sky. Venus has the closest approach to Earth of any planet in the solar system and also has the closest mass to Earth. As a result, Venus is sometimes called Earth's twin. Venus doesn't have a magnetic field generated by its core the way that Earth's does, but Venus's skies are so thick with gas, with 90 times the atmospheric pressure of Earth, that the planet's ionosphere produces its own magnetic field in interaction with the sun's weather. Venus also has winds that rotate around the planet extremely rapidly at up to around 200 miles per hour. On July 17th in Agherola, Italy, amateur astronomer Luigi Moroni photographed a nearly 5,000-long wall of clouds rotating around Venus's equator. According to NASA, this wall, known as the Venus Cloud Discontinuity, has occurred periodically since the early 1980s. Venus's atmosphere contains large amounts of carbon dioxide as well as sulfuric acid, H2SO4. Hence, the cloud has been nicknamed a wall of acid. In 2016, Javier Peralta documented images of this recurring wall using Akatsuki, Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency's Venus Orbiter. The fast-moving cloud wall occurs at between 30 and 35 miles above the planet's surface, and Peralta suggests that this wall is transferring rotational energy from the lower atmosphere to the upper atmosphere where it dissipates. Other similar giant waves have been discovered inside of Venus's atmosphere, such as a 6,000-mile-long stationary cloud wave known as a gravity wave. This is a weather phenomenon and is not to be confused with a gravitational wave. It's typically produced by mountains. Other gravity waves have been observed over Venus's Ishtar Terra mountain range. An Anhinga made an unprecedented stop in Maine. An Anhinga came as far north as Somerville in central Maine, about 70 miles from Portland, for several days in late July. This is the first time an Anhinga has been known to visit the state. The Anhinga is a fishing bird, sometimes mistaken for a cormorant. They're known for their long neck and a habit of spreading their wings out to dry after getting out of the water. They are native to South and Central America and the Caribbean, as well as the Atlantic coast of North America. The individual was first spotted on July 23rd and was last reported on the 26th. According to Smithsonian Magazine, the word Anhinga comes from the language of the Tupi people of what is now Brazil and means snake bird or devil bird. Lev Michael, a linguist specializing in Amazonian languages at UC Berkeley, disputed these meanings on his blog in 2023. He points out that the word Anhinga most closely resembles the Tupi word Anhanga, excuse my pronunciation, which translates to devil, so the meaning of devil bird may be a folk etymology created by earlier linguists. Did the park fire cause a fire tornado? The park fire is a wildfire currently burning in several counties, roughly in between Sacramento and Mount Shasta in Northern California. On Saturday, CAL FIRE said the fire had reached over 400,000 acres in size, and various news outlets are calling it the fourth largest wildfire in California history. With dry conditions over the weekend, the fire is expected to grow. There are also wildfires burning in many of the western United States. On Monday, a man named Ronnie Dean Stout II was charged with reckless arson after his car rolled off of an embankment and fell 60 feet in a park in Chico, located in Butte County. Stout claims that this was the result of an accident. A large vortex of smoke caused by the wildfire was captured on a remote camera on July 25th. This has left experts debating whether or not the vortex was simply a spinning column of smoke that was carried forward by the wind, or if it was powerful enough to contain a fire tornado. This is a type of tornado that can sometimes be produced by wildfires. The National Weather Service classifies a tornado on the basis of wind damage left in the trail of the vortex, such as trees or buildings being knocked over, for example. If the vortex wasn't powerful enough to cause wind damage, it might not end up being classified as a fire tornado. And now over to you, Jeff Knox.
All right, guys, bear with me. This is my longest presentation here to date. And this is something I spent quite a bit of time. I actually started working on researching this case really kind of several months ago when the Arrow report came out, and even a little bit before that. But been working on it pretty much every day for the last few weeks, digging through the original source material to kind of figure this case out. And so it's going to be long. I'll try and get through it as quick as I can. And so today we're going to be telling the story of the Alvin Moore fragment, which he would later call the Virginia Skystone, and how it essentially got turned into this story that Wilbert Smith would tell of a piece of debris being shot off a UFO in July 1952. And all of this takes place during the summer of 1952. The summer of 1952 is perhaps most famous in ufology for a flap of sightings around the nation's capital in the last half of July. This event, sometimes called the Washington Merry-Go-Round or Washington National Sightings, involved multiple targets picked up on air traffic control radars around Washington, D.C. These radar targets were watched for several hours by air traffic controllers over the night of July 19th and into the early morning of July 20th. Several Capital Airline pilots reported seeing these objects visually as white or glowing orange lights in the restricted airspace over the White House and the Capitol. By the time two F-94 interceptors arrive from Delaware at 3 a.m., the objects are nowhere to be found. The jets depart, and the UFOs are seen to return by another Capital Airlines pilot. Unknown radar targets continue to appear into the evening of the 20th, and this will eventually culminate in news articles about a 24-hour shoot-down order issued on July 28th and General Sanford's famous press conference on July 29th. I will point out this shoot-down order, while it was printed in the press on July 28th, was a bit of a, a myth and kind of a misunderstanding. There apparently was no actual shoot-down order. It was really just kind of secondhand information that got published in the paper. No shoot-down order would have actually been necessary due to the rules of engagement in the area. They wouldn't have actually needed a specific shoot-down order. So that's a bit of a myth. The shoot-down order did not happen, but it was widely publicized in the papers at the time. And again, there was the famous General Sanford's press conference on July 29th. But hidden amongst these relatively mundane cases of radar blips and white lights was a more sensational case involving an alleged metal debris sample from a UFO found on a farm in Virginia, outside of Washington, D.C. This is the case many people may have heard in some form before, but they likely have not heard the true story. For the story frequently told, as this is the case in ufology, is so distorted that the original characters have been completely removed and an entirely mostly new narrative has been created. This false story started to propagate in the UFO literature in the 1960s, thanks with the help of a few infamous UFO figures. And this is the story of the Alvin Moore UFO fragment and how it got turned into the Wilbert Smith shoot-down story. Now, just a little background information on Alvin Moore. Commander Alvin Moore was a very interesting character. He had quite an impressive background. That would seem to make him one of the more reliable and credible kind of like witnesses and people to talk about this topic, you would think. Educated at the U.S. Naval Academy, the American University, George Washington School of Law, University of Florida, and Louisiana State, he held bachelor's and master's degrees. He apparently was just shy of a PhD, but was too busy working for the government to finish that. He specialized in aeronautical engineering, and he was a patent engineer and attorney for Werner Van Braun's team at Huntsville, Alabama. He briefly worked as a border patrol agent in the newly formed border patrol in the mid 1920s along the Arizona-Mexico border, and he wrote a book called Border Patrol about his experiences there. He was briefly the vice consul for, I believe, Mexico for a while, and was a career, like I say, he was a career intelligence officer with the OSI and the CIA for a large part of his career. In addition to being a patent examiner specializing in aeronautics and propulsion patents, he also supposedly held over 50 of his own patents. I wasn't able to find 50, but I found several. And part of it might be because they're under different names, like they're under Alvin Moore or A.E. Moore. And so they don't all show up in the same listing. But he had quite a few patents, including for two for an airship design. But so the background is this guy is a seemingly intelligent guy, lots of education, lots of engineering knowledge, that was a career intelligence officer with the CIA and the Navy. And he basically kept a diary that would be printed in the form of this book, The Mystery of the Skymen, later on. And that diary was also reprinted by Timothy Beckley in 1997 under a different title, The Secret UFO Diary of CIA Operative Commander Alvin E. Moore. He actually had also written a book in 1952 called The World Republic, which he kind of advocates for a world federation or kind of like a world government. And so he's quite an interesting guy. He's written on quite a few different kind of topics there. But to get to our main story, on July 23rd, 1952, 69-year-old Robert L. Lanham and his 14-year-old grandson, Bitsy, Robert Wilson Lanham Jr., were walking through the woods near Alvin Moore's Pine Moor Estate, 20 miles outside of Washington, D.C., in Vienna, Virginia. And I'll point out, I spent some time trying to figure out kind of exactly where these estates were, and I had a little difficulty because the streets names don't really exist anymore. His address was kind of just Pine Moor on Route 1 in Vienna, Virginia. Only there's never been a Route 1 in Vienna, Virginia, unless he means Route 7. And census data would imply he did actually live on Route 7. But anyways, I spent some time trying to find exactly where, but really all that's important to know is that it was kind of in the woods, kind of outside of Vienna, Virginia there. And so they were walking kind of in these woods near Alvin Moore's estate. Most of the literature reports this happened on Alvin Moore's estate. That's where they found this thing. That's actually not true. Some of the literature then says actually it was on these Lanham people's estate. That's actually not true either. It was on an unknown neighbor's estate. So we don't exactly know where it happened. But they're out walking in these woods looking for a baby fox of a mother who had recently been killed in the area. And they kind of stopped to take a break about 50 feet from a groundhog's den. And they paused to rest and watch to see if they can see this groundhog come out. Suddenly, his grandson Bitsy says, "Granddaddy, isn't that a funny looking stone?" And Mr. Lanham watches as Bitsy goes and he picks up this stone laying on a bed of pine needles. It's not embedded in the ground or in a hole, as is frequently reported elsewhere. In fact, some of the literature says it was found in a hole reeking of a sulfurous smell. I just had to get sulfur in there for you guys. But no, that's not actually the case. It was just found on a bed of pine needles. None of the literature actually even says it was warm or still hot to the touch. They just said that it had a burnt smell to it. But it was just laying on these bed of pine needles. He felt it was no ordinary stone, though. It was too heavy for its size, and it had this kind of burned odor. And these photos, they're not the best photos, but they're the only photos we have kind of of this object, and they were taken by the National Bureau of Standards when they analyzed this object. According to Moore's notes on the back of them, supposedly before they tested or cut the object up. So they're all we have to go on, and they're not that legible. You can't really see them all that well, but it give you an idea of a stone, the stone that they found anyways. Now, 2 days later, on July 25th at 4 p.m., Mr. Lanham was receiving a ride home from his neighbor and boss for the last 4 or 5 years, Commander Alvin Moore. So Mr. Lanham basically kind of was like a caretaker and did work around his property for the last, several years. And Moore would end up giving him and sometimes his grandson like a ride home from his property back like to their place or to the grandson's house. And at this occasion, he was doing that. He was giving Mr. Lanham a ride home with another guy. And Mr. Lanham decided to tell Moore about this curious stone and offered to show him this stone sample that his grandson had found out in the woods. He thought it might be a meteorite at first and perhaps wanted opinion on this curious stone he found. Moore tells Lanham about these newspaper accounts of these flying saucers because this is just days after, the Washington flap happened on the 19th and 20th. And but Moore, Lanham basically had not followed the stories. He hadn't really heard of them, and he didn't really seem interested in these flying saucer stories at all. But Moore was fascinated because realizing that this object was found underneath the path between Washington, D.C. and Herndon, Virginia, which is basically where Dulles International Airport is now, is where this object was found. And it's where these radar operators and veteran pilots supposedly saw these flying saucers or glowing objects, as they'll be reported. And so he became very interested in this object, thinking there might be a relation there. So examining the object closely, you can no longer smell the burnt smell that was present when the object was first found, but it had been 2 days since then it was found. And Moore obtains Lanham's permission to have the stone examined by the government. And at this point, Moore works as the chief of the technical information branch at the Bureau of Aeronautics. And the Bureau of Aeronautics, I was a bit confused at first until I looked it up, It doesn't have anything to do with like NASA or an early NASA. The Bureau of Aeronautics was the U.S. Navy's material support organization. They were for naval aviation from 1921 through 1959. They had the responsibility for the design, procurement, and support of naval aircraft and related systems. And he was the chief of the technical information branch there. And he wanted to send this object off for analysis, but he didn't kind of want to go off half-cocked without having done some preliminary investigation of his own to see what he could kind of figure out. And so on July 29th, after periodically studying the stone over the preceding weekend, he logged the following kind of description in his journal. It obviously had been at some point fractured on two of its surfaces. The edges of the fractures are very sharp and in places come to this sharp points. One very small part of the fractures looked as though it was done recently. The stone is bluish gray in color, and I believe it is several times heavier than the same volume of an ordinary stone. Its longest dimension is about 4 inches. On the surface of it, it is cylindrical, with the chord of the arc of the cylindrical surface being slightly over 3 inches, and with a distance of 2 5/8 inches between the arc. The cylindrical surface obviously has been intelligently shaped, either by casting or tooling. I believe tooling. There are fragmented coatings of a cement-like substance on the cylindrical surface. The largest of the fractured surfaces has yellowish or brown stains, mostly located along the sharp edges of the fractures. These stains look like stains from a very hot flame. Also on this surface, as well as on parts of the other 2 fractured surfaces, there are embedded in the stone-like material a large number of little balls of sizes varying from 1/8 of an inch in diameter to pinpoint size. Note, by the time of this letter that was sent to Ruppelt on August 8th, the stains were not very prominent anymore. And later in that evening, Moore accompanied Latham to the area of the woods where this object had been found to examine the wood. And they examined this wooded area for about an hour and a half, looking for any kind of smashed trees or additional evidence that would support that this object kind of was coming from the air. But besides for a small kind of brush between where the object was found, that may have been exposed to heat, but it may have just died from the drought that I guess was taking place, they didn't really find anything of interest at that time. On July 30th, Moore finally decides to take this stony object to the U.S. Bureau of Standards and shows it to 5 scientists who all indicate, after briefly examining the object, they could not identify it. Most felt it was not a natural stone. Mr. H. Hockman of the Bureau Stone Section, Mineral Products Division, weighed the stone and determined it had a dry weight of 532.91 grams, or roughly 1.2 pounds, and that its specific gravity was 3.48. Far outside the range of the specific gravity of common stones, which according to a book they referenced only had a range of 2.2 to 2.8. Now, Hockman and Moore, they then measured the radius of that cylindrical surface. It's approximately 5.2 inches. And they extrapolate from that if the object had come from a cylinder, it would have had a radius of roughly 10.4 inches. Elsewhere, I believe he's kind of says close to 2 feet, and later on, other people kind of will describe, say, close to 2 feet for this sample. Now, one of the people he showed it to is Dr. John McBurney, also of the Mineral Products Division. He examined many meteorites, in his life, and had stated that it was not a meteorite. The object was eventually turned over to Mr. H.F. McMurdy, chief of the Constitution and Microstructure section, for further analysis. And it is suggested by Moore that they don't tell any of the assistants where the object came from, so as to not bias the results. And this is actually important to remember, because many people later on, people will make an issue of the fact that the analysts weren't told where it came from, and how could they possibly analyze it if they weren't told where it came from. But the fact of the matter is, they were suggested by Moore himself to not say where the object came from. And frankly, you don't need to know where the object came from to perform a chemical analysis on it. So keep that in mind. So they say the object, don't tell them it came from the air, so they're not biased at results. Later that evening, Moore decides to kind of return to the area where the object had been found, to spend another hour and a half exploring to see if he can kind of find any other evidence and checking the areas he didn't check on his last visit. And there's 3 kind of photos of the woods and the trees here. They're even worse than the stone photos. I almost didn't include them. but I did. And during this search, he finds roughly 45 feet from where the object was a smashed and fallen dead sassafras tree, pointing generally in the direction that this object was found. So the following day, he phones the U.S. Forest Service and gets in contact with Mr. Everett H. Clocker, who's a forester, and he comes out to investigate the scene later that day, and again on August 2nd. And Moore kind of comes to the conclusion after going out there to investigate with him, and he has kind of this to say about the fallen tree. It was very recently hit at a point of 21 feet and 9 inches above the ground by an object from the air, which had apparently sheared off the outer edge and broken off the butt end of the limb of a neighboring tree at a point 42 feet in the air. I surmise that the fallen tree was nearly broken in two by this object. Now, unfortunately, the expert, Mr. Clocker with the Forest Service, does not really feel the same way about the tree damage. He comes out and he says that this tree apparently has been dead for some time now, and like all such trees, had to fall sooner or later. And you can only add that evidently the tree had fallen very recently, perhaps within like the last week or two. A couple of days later, he gets a phone call on August 5th to receive an informal report from Mr. Mitchell H.F. McMurdy of the Constitution and Microstructure branch that had been given the stone for analysis. And he records the kind of following notes about the stone and from this phone call. He reports, the object is not a natural stone. The main part of the object is made up of silica and iron and magnesium and calcium, with equal quantities of iron and silica, which were the main things in it. The balls, quite small to something like 1/8 of an inch in the old fractured surface, made of glassy material, with some pure iron, rich in iron and silica. They are magnetic, and some were extracted with a magnet. The cement coating was principally calcium carbonate. The general opinion of the men in the Bureau of Standards to examine the object is that it's not a meteorite. It is not radioactive, and I quote, because it's important, it looks similar to slag. So Moore, actually, you might think he might be disappointed at this, that they kind of told him that his samples basically looks like slag, but actually he's kind of elated and satisfied with this result because it tells him that this object is artificial. It's not just a natural stone that he found, and it's not a meteorite, but it was constructed in some way by someone, and that it had to get there somehow. And so for Moore, the answer was obvious. One of these glowing objects flying over the Washington National sighting must have ejected this debris for some reason. Now, perhaps, it was shot off by an encounter with a jet, or perhaps it was some natural process of the way this ship works. But he was sure that the stone must have came from the sky, and because it was in the path where these objects were seen, he was convinced it must have came from one of those objects. He did not believe it came from any sort of United States domestic or foreign aircraft. And so, satisfied with these results and his preliminary inquiry into the stone, he finally decides to send his results in and get the government to further look at this. And so he forwards the sample to Project Blue Book at the Air Force for further investigation. And on August 13th, 1952, he sends this stone. He sends this 8-page report on the object's recovery. And most of the quotes that I've included to this point come from this 8-page report letter that he wrote to Ruppelt. And he sends in this letter for us, the forester Crocker sent on the tree fall, which is a few pages. He sent in those 3 photos of the stone and those additional 3 photos of the fallen trees. And he sent them all attention to Captain Edward Ruppelt, Blue Book's commanding officer, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Dayton, Ohio. Now, the Air Force apparently either lost or misdirected the sample or report for some time. Because on December 24th, a little irritated Alvin Moore would write a 4-page handwritten letter addressed to Ruppelt again, expressing his displeasure that he has not heard anything back from the Air Force about the analysis of his stone. He reiterates that he asked the Air Force not to mutilate his sample too badly. And after they had kept it for a few months so they could compare it if there's any other UFO debris or hardware that came in so they could do a comparative analysis, that they should then send it back to him, as requested. And so he asked Wilbert to check his files and please return the stone back to him. Now, possibly spurred into action by Moore's letter in December, at the beginning of January 1953, the Air Force would send Moore's sample to Howard C. Cross, who's in the employment of the Battelle Memorial Institute. Now, in some of the stories about this, they just kind of mention this Cross guy as like a lab tech, and they're unsure of where he works, whether he worked at Ohio State or Battelle. But it turns out Howard Cross is actually pretty infamous in UFO circles. He's a pretty interesting character. He's perhaps most well known as the author of the infamous 1953 Pentacle Memo, popularized by ufologist and conspiracy theorist Jacques Vallée, who basically, this letter was written just about a month before he analyzed the Moore sample. And Vallée basically interprets this article as that there was a cover-up, there was a secret UFO project that was going on that people didn't know about, and that they were, because they talk about a plan of like simulating UFO sightings to be able to like, figure out how people report them and whatnot. Only there was no cover-up. There was the secret UFO project. Well, it was sort of secret. It's the Battelle Special Report 14 statistical study they were doing. There was nothing like otherwise secret going on. So this memo got really famous by Jacques Vallée, but it's actually pretty mundane. And it's just the Battelle Institute basically like begging for time to finish their analysis before the Robinson panel, which is going to be taking place a week or so after this letter was written. So all that conspiratorial sense was nonsense, but he's perhaps most famous for that letter. And he's also considered by some to be the scientist, sometimes they call him the Roswell metallurgist, because they say he was involved with analyzing the supposed memory metal from Roswell. And he was Battelle's expert on titanium. And a lot of the research that went into titanium is a component of nitinol, which is actually a memory metal, which some conspiracy theorists believe came from the Roswell crash. It didn't. But he was involved in all the development of that stuff. And so very interesting, very smart guy that was kind of downplayed in this original story. They don't mention he's Dr. Howard Cross from Battelle. And he essentially analyzes this metal. He does a cursory examination, and people, a lot of researchers get really kind of conspiratorial about this cursory examination. They basically say that's code word for they debunked it. They didn't look at it. They just put out some nonsense like after just a quick check. Like that doesn't really actually make sense. Like that's not what they mean by cursory examination. So what he did is he observed this object under transmitted and reflected polarized light. He's basically doing some spectroscopy on this object. And he submitted this brief report in a letter to the Air Force on February 4th, in which he puts a further dent into the meteoric theory, confirming the opinions of the National Bureau of Science scientist, a standard scientist, that neither the texture nor the mineralogical composition of the specimen is comparable with the texture and mineralogical composition of known stony meteorites. Cross also confirms that the sample is similar in slag as the National Bureau of Standard Scientists had suggested. He elaborates, this cursory examination indicates that both texturally and mineralogically, the specimen bears a strong resemblance to very basic slag from an open hearth furnace. The elemental composition of the object contains various orthosilicates, calcium ferrite, ferrous oxide, and metallic iron. And orthosilicates are basically is a silicon molecule. It's got 4 hydrogens. It's Si4 negative. And so those tricalcium silicate, dicalcium silicate, those would be orthosilicates of like Na2 Si04 minus. Not that anybody really needs to know that. Anyways, so it's basically determined it was like common open hearth slag. So an open hearth furnace, if people don't know, is a type of industrial furnace that used to widely be used to produce steel. It's not used so much anymore, although Ukraine is one of the few countries that still, I guess, use it pretty extensively. But most people have moved on to other methods. And it's used to produce steel by burning excess carbon and other impurities out of pig iron. And how it works is the furnace is first charged with scrap metal and pig iron. It is then heated using burning gases, which melt the charge. Atmospheric oxygen and iron oxide are then added in to help oxidize that carbon, forming carbon monoxide that they're trying to remove the excess of. And then molten steel is formed as the impurities are removed. Slag forming agents like limestone, so calcium carbonates and whatnot, are added to remove the impurities, and the slag gets skimmed off, typically into these slag thimbles using these large ladles. This excess slag then gets dumped into sand pits as waste and allowed to cool. So again, silica, you might be getting that from the sand pits, and the process has largely been superseded in modern times by basic oxygen steelmaking using blast furnaces and electric arc furnaces. It's still essentially the same process. What happens is they have this vessel, and the molten steel gets formed on the bottom underneath a layer of slag. And the slag layer also kind of protects that molten steel from like oxidation and whatnot. And they tap the molten steel off the bottom and skim the slag off the top. And these furnaces, and even nowadays in the more modern ways of making steel with basic oxygen steel making, they're still using basically a furnace, only their ladle introduces oxygen through a pipe to oxygenate as they steel it, and they use things like electric arc furnaces for the heating of the vessels. But it's still essentially the same process where the slag, where the molten steel comes out the bottom and they skim the slag off the top. Now, these furnaces, though, were quite popular back in the first half of the last century, even though they've been typically replaced now. And they were quite popular in Virginia as well. And it was not uncommon to actually find slag in all sorts of obscure locations. The slag ends up getting commercially used in construction and road work. And in this image here, you can see these slag thimbles and the kind of process, and the slag gets kind of skimmed off the top and put in these little round thimbles, which may in fact end up being 2 feet or whatever diameter they determine from the curvature of the stone, may match, one of the edges of these thimbles here. And these thimbles dump it into sand pits like that, and they collect all that little rock, and they use it in road construction and other construction projects. And so you can find this stuff like all sorts of places. And I will point out, UFO researcher Michael Swartz, who I mentioned I used some of this work, he grew up, I believe, in West Virginia, and pointed out that from looking at the photos of this stone, granted, the photos are pretty bad, it looks almost identical to what he would see as a child that he would find, exploring West Virginia on the ground, pieces of slag from these open hearth furnaces. So this object basically, for all intents and purposes, was identical to what you would find from an open slag furnace. Now, Todd Zeckel, which is a researcher who wrote an article on this case, and more, they make a big deal of how the slag theory doesn't really work because the object was the result of something coming through the air, through the trees. So how could it be slag if it came from the air? Again, but the problem is they don't really have any evidence of that. It's just a belief. As we know, the trees were actually rotten and had nothing to do with the sample. The sample was found on the ground. It does not explain how it got there from the furnace, but there's no reason to believe that it came from the air. They also kind of make a lot of conspiratorial statements about how Cross had not been informed about where the object came from, and so how could he possibly, analyze it? But as I just pointed out, Moore actually told people not to say where the object came from as to not bias the results. But then he later goes on to get all conspiratorial and act like he couldn't have come to the right answer because he wasn't told. So, yeah, it's, and Zeckel also kind of goes on to say that they didn't take into consideration Moore's high caliber and status as a witness and credibility. But I'll point out the only problem with that is that Moore wasn't a witness to anything. He didn't even find the object. He's just kind of like a third-party player. So, quite frankly, his credibility doesn't have anything to do with anything in this situation. Anyways, 6 days later, on February 10th, Air Force Major Robert Brown responds to Moore's handwritten letter to Ruppelt. And he explains to Moore that his letter had gotten misrouted, and that was kind of responsible for the delay in responding to his initial report. He goes on to quote directly from Dr. Cross's February 4th report, stating, both textually and mineralogically, the specimen bears a strong resemblance to very basic slag from an open hearth furnace. The Air Force promises to return the statement within the next week, the specimen within the next week. And on February 16th, they do mail the sample back to Moore. But it's interesting because according to Moore, the sample wasn't returned until mid next year, mid 1954. But the information we have from the Air Force implies it was mailed back on February 16th, 1953. And Zeckel would state that it was only mailed back after repeated requests from Moore to get this sample back. I think perhaps they just mean that handwritten letter that Moore wrote in December 1952. There's no evidence of any other correspondence between Moore and the Air Force regarding this sample or trying to get it back. And they responded pretty quickly saying they were mailing it back. So I think that perhaps is just a detail that's gotten wrong elsewhere. In early 1953, though, Moore, who had left the CIA, he was working at the CIA for a while, he left to return to active duty for the Korean War. And in early 1953, he retires from his active duty. He joins the Naval Reserves and was looking to go back to the CIA because I guess he had a time period in which he had to exert his right to return to the CIA, that if he didn't exert it, that he couldn't come back or something. And so he wanted to return to the CIA. But before he could do that, he wanted to take a brief sabbatical to finish this manuscript for UFO book he'd been planning to write based on those notes, his diary, basically, that he'd been keeping. And originally, this book was supposed to be titled The Space Island Menace. And he felt that after he went back to the CIA, he would never be able to get it published. It would never get through publication approval. So he was worried about that DOPSR approval, I'm telling you. But so he tried to get it published before he went back so he could sneak it in before they could tell him he couldn't put it out there. Unfortunately, he had trouble finding a publisher that kind of wanted to print his book. He spent some time in July 1953 talking to publishers. I believe he talked to like Henry Holt, like Keogh's publisher, and he talked to True, and he talked to one publisher that was most interested in publishing the book, but they were mostly a textbook publisher. And they kind of felt his book was a bit too speculative and out there, and it would hurt the credibility of the textbook publishing business. And so they kind of backed out of it. So he was unable to get anybody that wanted to publish his kind of UFO book. And I can see why, even only going through half of it is pretty wild. So he eventually scraps these plans, decides to turn to work full time at the CIA. He goes back in October and to exert his right to return to the CIA. They basically tell him they're not going to allow him to take off any more time of work once he comes back. And so you better get ready. It turns out, due to some paperwork issues, he wasn't able to return to work at the CIA until early 1954. But in 1954, Moore is employed in the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence and was back in possession of this found object that he got from the Air Force. And while working at CIA headquarters, he became friends with Captain Donald Goodspeed of the Canadian Army Intelligence, who was attached to the CIA in a liaison role. And having expressed interest in UFOs and in Moore's Virginia Skystone, Moore decides to invite this guy to this Pine Moor estate on August 6, 1954, where they spend the evening discussing his UFO theories and the UFO projects of this prospective governments, the Blue Book, Project Magnet up in Canada, as well as Moore's Virginia Skystone. And at this meeting, Moore presents the cylinder sample to Goodspeed to take back to Canada and have it analyzed by their project scientist. Moore felt that the Canadian project might be more open-minded than its American counterpart in its analysis. And he also gave Goodspeed a gelatinous blob that his wife had collected in their front yard. And this kind of gets into some of his later theories on sky stones and sky islands and sky chemicals. That I might mention a bit later. But so the captain wraps up this material in foil so he can take it back to Canada and analyze. But by the time he opens the package in Canada, this gelatinous blob is kind of turned into this cobweb-like substance, which eventually kind of dissolves into a brown powder. Basically an angel hair kind of like case situation, almost like it kind of dissolves away. And in a letter kind of to researcher Ted Zeckel, Goodspeed would report that he believes he gave the sample directly to kind of Wilbert Smith, the former head of Canada's UFO project Magnet, for analysis. Now, we know very little of what happened to the sample when it was in Smith's or the Canadian UFO project's custody. We do know after examination by the project, and allegedly it was examined by the AVRO company, the people familiar with the Avro project. At least according to Art Lundahl, who said they were interested in the material for, I don't know, a propulsion cylinder for their project or something. And we don't really know where he gets that claim from. But according to Art Lundell, anyways, the Abbey Road Project was interested and they analyzed the sample. But they didn't have it very long because the sample was returned to Moore in late 1954. And, they didn't even get it from him until August 6th. So, it wouldn't have been in Canadian government custody's hands for all that long. And Captain Goodspeed, he wasn't able to return the sample personally. He had to send it back by courier, but he did send a letter on January 31st, 1955, stating that our analysis concludes that your material, this cylinder, was neither a natural stone nor a meteorite. Not really kind of telling us anything we didn't really already know. He also basically says that it has iron and silica, the principal constituents, with magnesium and calcium included as well. Tiny balls up to 1/8 inch diameter of pure iron occur in the material. A calcium carbonate cement occurs as fragmented coating on the apparently cylindrical elements of the surface. So so yeah, that's basically the Canadian government's results are identical to what the National Bureau of Standards kind of determined, and everyone else already kind of determined. Now, researcher Ted Zeckel reports that shortly after the object was returned by the Canadian government, Moore was approached by Dr. H. Marshall Chadwell, the CIA's director of scientific intelligence, in his office. Chadwell had heard about this mysterious cylinder stone and asked if he could borrow it for further analysis. Moore, apparently shocked after 2 years earlier being told to mind his own business when it comes to UFOs after he had proposed a UFO research project, still happily turned this project over to Chadwell. And this is actually the article by Todd Zeckel using a pseudonym, Ted Zachary, that was published in Saga's UFO Report, November 1977. And I actually scanned that myself because I own that. And about a week later, Chadwell returns the sample by messenger, not by hand, and he doesn't include any comments of the results or any sort of analysis of it. Now, Chadwell, if people aren't familiar, like I said, he was the director of the Office of Scientific Intelligence, but he was also heavily involved in the UFO topic, the Robertson panel, and tried to kind of corresponding with people like the MIT's Lincoln Group on their interest in study of the UFO topic. So he was kind of like one of the main people at the CIA kind of spearheading the UFO project. And if you recall, again, the Robertson panel took place in January of 1953. Now, supposedly after Moore gets the sample back, he puts it in his CIA office safe. 2 weeks later, Moore is supposedly going to go to the safe to get some documents out and notice the object is missing. Zeckel makes a lot of fuss about how could something possibly get stolen from the CIA, from a CIA office safe inside of the CIA headquarters, one of the most secure places in the world. And so that obviously means it was stolen by the CIA itself. Now, unfortunately, elsewhere, Moore states he doesn't actually remember if the object went missing from his office at the CIA or at his home. And just last night, I found an article or a letter so Zeckel's article was basically essentially plagiarized or copied by his friend, Stephen Soix, and published in Fate. And Moore read that in 1978 and wrote a letter to respond to kind of provide some details in which he states that, actually, I don't believe it was ever at the CIA office, and it didn't go missing from the CIA office. I believe it was at my house where it went missing. Only he does believe it was stolen. Only he believed it was stolen by the men in black, aka the Skymen, that are monitoring him and spying on him, and they stole the sample from him. But that it was stolen from his home. So a great deal of the narrative about the CIA's involvement that's published in magazines is nonsense. I'll say Zeckel's article, while it has some details on that we'll address, gets most of the details on the case wrong, which is surprising considering he talked to Moore himself. So we kind of have to toss that CIA stole the piece example, but the CIA does get involved in Wilbert Smith's story here as well. And so now we get into the Wilbert Smith version of the story. And Wilbert Smith was a guy that he was a Canadian radio engineer. He had a master's in electrical engineering. He worked for the Department of Transport, and he was essentially, his job and duties involved broadcast communication standards, things like testing, like radio equipment testing standards and stuff for gear that was used, determining like the frequencies of radio and TV stations and whatnot. His job was mostly in communications and broadcasting and standards and whatnot. But he's most famous in the UFO community for his involvement in something called Project Magnet, which has been kind of hyped up as the Canadian government's kind of UFO project. But from my research, I kind of think of Wilbert Smith as Canada's Lou Elizondo. It turns out most of his project wasn't really official, didn't have official standing. It was mostly him doing it on his own or with some other people. And they even, I guess, later came out and said Project Magnet didn't even have anything to do with UFOs. It was about studying magnetic properties and fields, and that it was just Smith's hobby project that they let him do on his own time. So his actual involvement in official Canadian UFO governments is sketchy at best, but that's what he's widely kind of known for anyways. And he's also perhaps more famously known for a letter, supposedly communication he had with Dr. Sarbecker after a broadcast conference in Washington, D.C., where Sarbecker allegedly told him, like, we have crash saucers, the security is higher than that of the atom bomb, etc. Only problem is Sarbecker, I believe, later said that if he did say that, it was basically second, third-hand rumors that he'd heard from people. Like, it wasn't actually based on anything he knew. So, again, there's a lot of Smith's pretty famous for a lot of reasons, and many of them are kind of out there and don't hold up to substantiation when you kind of look at them. But anyways, Wilbert Smith gets involved in this story, and this is how I kind of get involved in this story again, is that on February 2024, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office released the first volume of its long-awaited historical report, and brought renewed attention to Wilbert Smith's claim about a piece of debris being shot off a UFO by a jet during the Washington, D.C. flap in July 1952. Smith's version of the story is very similar, as you'll see, but with an added UFO kind of element bolted on to Moore's story. And they sort of, in the panel, they say, in Frank Edwards, in a 1966 book, that a piece of a UFO was recovered near Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1952. It was shot off of a 2-foot diameter glowing disc and dislodged a 1-pound fragment. Recall Moore's sample was close to a pound before they cut some of it off. And that 1-pound fragment was recovered by a ground team. The U.S. government had loaned this fragment to the Canadian government, and the Condon panel essentially determined that these claims are most likely false. And this story in the air report kind of got the debrief to publish a story on it, and I had done some threads on it back then as well. And so it kind of came back in the attention again. And as we can see in Smith's version, at allegedly the same time as the Moore case, and if you look like in various listings, they have them exactly the same time, 9 p.m., July 23rd, 1952. A U.S. Navy fighter jet fires on this 2-foot diameter glowing disc, dislodging this 1-pound fragment. Smith elaborates, I was informed that the disc was glowing and it was about 2 feet in diameter. A glowing chunk flew off and the pilot saw it glowing all the way to the ground. He radioed his report and a ground party hurried to the scene. The thing was still glowing when they found it an hour later. Now, again, we don't know exactly who he was informed by about this at this point. Now, the Wilbert Smith version of the story, as the Arrow report mentions, was first brought to widespread attention by radio broadcaster Frank Edwards in his 1966 book, Flying Saucers, Serious Business, original 1966 version of the book. And in this version, in Frank Edwards' coverage, he points us to the very first mention of the story in Donald Kehoe's 1955 book, Flying Saucer Conspiracy. Now, the first thing you might notice here is that he says he gets the story from a Lieutenant Commander Frank Thompson. Now, keep that in mind because that's actually wrong. And this error would later be compounded when the Condon Project attempts to find records of a Frank Thompson and had no success. What they should have been searching for was the Lieutenant Commander Frank Thomas. Lieutenant Commander Frank Thomas was the man actually heading up the U.S. Navy's small private UFO study and was Edward Ruppelt's Navy contact during the Blue Book years. He was also the friend and source of Donald Kehoe, who he fed multiple UFO cases to that would be later published in his books. And I tried to find more information on Thomas. He's kind of hard for you to find anything about. One of the only mentions I found was a meeting between him and Ruppelt when Ruppelt was trying to go meet a Stephen Posseney, I believe about a trip that he had made to Europe that involved flying saucers. And before he met with Posseney, he decides to stop to talk to Frank Thomas about UFOs. So the name was Frank Thomas. And as we see when we look in the first mention of the story, directly quoted or referenced by Frank Edwards, and again, 1955 edition of that book as well. Donald Kehoe lists the story that contains the more basic elements of the Moore story kind of before it got distorted. Now, Kehoe reports how he received the report from Lieutenant Frank Thomas, not Thompson, as Edward later gets wrong and misspells. Kehoe states that according to Thomas, a peculiar object had fallen near Washington during the mass saucer sightings in 1952. It was retrieved by a naval officer, which we know to be now Alvin Moore. It was analyzed by the Bureau of Standards. This is the Moore story as we know it. A curious stony object was found near Washington, D.C. during the time of the sightings. It's involving a naval officer. And remember, Moore had asked people not to use his real name. He had said, if you're going to publish this story, just say, I'm a naval officer near D.C., which they did, and that he had it analyzed by the Bureau of Standards, just like the Moore story. They had difficulty identifying the object, and afterwards the object was given to W.B. Wilbert Smith at Ottawa for further analysis. So in the initial version of the story, there's not the shoot down, just that it came from the air. So where's the shoot down story come from? Because it's not in it at that point. Only the implication that it came from the air, so you might imply that it came from an object that was shot down. The shoot down story enters a little bit later. Enter Wilbert Smith and Albert Herbert Knowles. So in the March 1986 edition of Just Cause, the newsletter of Citizens Against UFO Secrecy, they were kind of a FOIA group with like Barry Greenwood and Peter Gersten, and they tried to get government UFO files out of the government and filed lawsuits. And in their newsletter, we see that Fitch had been told by a former NICAP board member, and this is Ohio ufologist C. Wesley Fitch, that Reverend Albert Baller, he was a NICAP board member, that Abner Knowles, who was also a NICAP board member, was a guest at Reverend Baller's home one evening when the topic of UFOs came up. Knowles was also a board member of NICAP, but apparently had not mentioned the UFO tale previously that he was to tell that night to Reverend Baller. Fitch took fragments of this story that Reverend Baller had related to him and then proceeded to contact Abner Knowles at his home in Elliott, Maine. We learned that at some point in early 1961, so that Albert Baller relayed this story about this UFO debris he heard from Knowles to this ufologist, C. Wesley Fitch. Fitch sent a letter to Knowles requesting further information, and he received this reply on August 27, 1961. And he says, yes, I have a piece of the small disc in my hands. It is shown me by Wilbert Smith. At that time, 1952, Mr. Smith was heading the flying saucer research of the Canadian government and working in very close cooperation with the authorities in Washington, D.C. He is still very much interested in this matter and does independent research. The Canadian government has officially abandoned the project. To the best of my recollection, the object was shot down by a plane and seen to fall in the yard of a farmer across the river in Virginia. Upon searching the area, several pieces were found, one on which turned over to Mr. Smith for independent research. In one of his trips to see me, he brought this piece along for my inspection. It was a chunk of amorphous metal-like structure, brownish in color where it was broken, where a curved edge indicated the whole thing to have been not over 2 inches in diameter. The edge was rounded in cross-section, perhaps a quarter-inch thick, and obviously swelled to a considerable greater thickness in the center. The outer surface was smooth, but not polished, and at the broken sections there were obviously iron particles and even evidence of iron rust. I would say that the weight was roughly somewhat lighter than if solid iron, but it was not extremely light. Mr. Smith told me that the chemical test had been made of the piece at hand and that iron had been found in it, but little else could be identified. Now, size kind of size estimates of the disk seem mostly to be based on extrapolating the size of the object based on the assumption that the curvature of that broken piece came from a cylinder shape, not actual witness testimony. So it's entirely possible they got that 2 feet estimate by their measurements of the pieces, and that's why they thought the object was 2 feet that it came off of. The only problem is that this sort of mentions Knowles seeing the piece in 1952, which isn't actually possible. I can't help but think that they conflated when the event happened, not when he actually saw the piece, because as we know, Smith did not even have the piece until late 1954, and he only had it briefly. By early 1955. The piece was already back in Moore's hands, so he could not have seen that piece actually in 1952. But he did follow up again with another letter in October 1961, which he kind of sketches out the pieces he remembers being shown. And this account by Smith, relayed by Knowles, is still fairly close to the Morse story. But for the first time, we hear them explain that this piece fell on the farm after it was shot down by a UFO. And comparing the photos that we have with the drawing, I'm not sure that really helps because, again, these photos were taken supposedly before pieces were broken off, and the drawing is from memory. But I put them up there anyways. Now, one might think, I find it unbelievable that the U.S. government would give off a piece of a flying saucer if we thought it was a flying saucer, even to our closest allies like the Canadians, or that Smith would be allowed to just going around showing it to anyone, even if they are retired admirals. Now, some researchers justify this by suggesting that if there was enough pieces to go around, then they might have enough to share. That doesn't exactly make any sense to me, but at some point, probably when he sent a letter to Knowles, Fitch also directly reached out to Wilbert Smith for confirmation of this story. And in a letter on October 23rd, Smith wrote, "There was a great deal of this around, most of it in U.S. official, not U.S. Air Force hands, but there's quite a bit of it in private hands as well." Now, it's unclear, but I don't actually think he believes he's talking specifically about the sample that we're talking about. I think he's just referring to UFO debris in general in this situation. And he does later say, speaking on the subject of UFOs before the Illuminating Engineering Society Canada Regional Conference on January 11th, 1959, he further elaborates on UFO hardware, stating, "Various items of hardware are known to exist, but they're usually clapped into security and not available to the general public." So, Fitch, in November 1961, Fitch and another researcher, George Popovich from Akron, Ohio, are able to record a telephone interview with Robert Smith. And it's here that we hear for the first time the story directly from Smith. His account of the shootdown remarkably matches the version shared by Knowles, which shouldn't be surprising since he told it to Knowles. Fitch asks him, "I've been told by a mutual friend in 1952 you showed Admiral Knowles a piece of a flying saucer. Is that statement correct, sir?" Smith, "Yes, it is correct. I visited Admiral Knowles, and I had with me a piece which had been shot from a small flying saucer near Washington in that year, 1952. I showed it to the Admiral. It was a small piece of metal about twice the size of your thumb, which had been loaned to me for a very short time by your Air Force." Fitch, "What about this particular piece from the UFO near Washington? Did it differ from conventional materials? Was there anything unusual about it, sir?" Smith, "Well, the story behind it is this. The pilot was chasing a glowing disc about 2 feet in diameter." Fitch, "Pardon me, sir, but did you say 2 feet? Smith, "Yes, that is correct. I was informed that the disc was glowing and that it was about 2 feet in diameter. A glowing chunk flew off and the pilot saw it glowing all the way to the ground. He radioed his report and the ground party hurried to the scene. The thing was still glowing when they found it about an hour later. The entire piece weighed about a pound. The segment that was loaned to me was about 1/3 of that. It had been sawed off." Fitch, "What did the analysis show?" Smith, "There was iron rust. The thing was in really a matrix of magnesium orthosilicate. The matrix had a great number, thousands of these 15-micron spheres scattered through it." Fitch, "You say that you had to return it. Did you return it to the Air Force, Mr. Smith?" Sorry. "No, not the Air Force, much higher than that." Fitch, "The Central Intelligence Agency?" Smith chuckles, "I'm sorry, gentlemen, but I do not care to go beyond that point. I can say to you that it went into the hands of a highly classified group. You will have to solve that problem, their identity, for yourself." And as we know, this Moore sample did end up in the hands of the CIA briefly, so that kind of matches. So in this interview, Smith describes the material in a manner approximately identical to the Moore fragment. He states that it was some piece of debris that had been cut into 3 pieces. We have 3 photos from the Bureau of Standards showing 3 pieces that we can possibly infer were he got one of those pieces. He describes it as being roughly 1 pound, like the Moore piece. More importantly, he describes it as a matrix of magnesium orthosilicate with great numbers, thousands of 15-micron spheres scattered throughout it. Recall how the Moore fragment contained mostly magnesium orthosilicates and was impregnated with microspherules, iron microspherules throughout. They're clearly talking about the same piece of debris that was analyzed. Smith, who had apparently got the story of the fragment secondhand, somehow glued on this extra element of a U.S. jet shoot down of a 2 small-foot diameter disc dislodging this piece of the craft. Frank Edwards would include the Smith story and take a partial transcript from the interview he did over the telephone with Fitch and Popovich and print that in his book, Flying Saucers Serious Business. Edwards apparently connects the original story that he had found in Kehoe's book, Flying Saucer Conspiracy, on the Moore piece. And at that point, these stories get fused together, and the relatively mundane Moore story gets forgotten, if it was ever really kind of known in the first place, because, like I say, they don't really mention his name anywhere. The Moore story really only ever gets told originally in Flying Saucers Conspiracy by Kehoe, and it's a brief story. Now, the Smith version of the story, Cylinder Fragment, reported by Edwards, along with 2 other cases of hardware, are investigated and reported on in the Condon Panel report. An Arrow report directly references the Condon Panel's work on this case, and they likely went no further than just reporting what the Condon Panel found. A lot of people give the Arrow report kind of a bad name for some of the bad information they put out. But in many cases, I believe it's just because they're just referencing the results of what the U.S. government already determined. And in this case, I don't believe they actually investigated this. They took what the Condon Project put out and reported those results in their report. Now, the shoot-down event was covered in a section of the Condon report called "The Parts of UFOs or UFO Equipment" that addressed these alleged pieces of UFO hardware. And the report repeats basically the same story reported by Edwards and Smith. Robert Lowe, the Condon Committee project coordinator, unfortunately had kind of no luck locating any records of a shoot-down event in July 1952 when he asked Blue Book. But understanding that such an event might be beyond their clearance level, they reached out to the Air Force headquarters for kind of comment on the story to see what they kind of found. And he sent this letter to them requesting information. And they receive a response directly from J.W. Clinton by direction of the Chief of Information Department of the Navy. And in this response, they indicate that they did a thorough search of all the Navy records. And again, they failed to reveal any account of a Navy jet fighter's encounter with a UFO in July 1952 or at any other time. They further state the U.S. Navy, would not be flying jets with live ammunition over Washington, D.C. area. Navy jets only carry live ammunition during firing practice conducted in restricted training ranges far out to sea. Mr. Clinton also points out air defense and intercept functions are the function of the U.S. Air Force. The Navy operating an interceptor function that they are not equipped to provide over the Capitol would be usurping the Air Force's duty. And further, it's no surprise that they were unable to locate any matching records for Lieutenant Commander Frank Thompson, because the correct name was Frank Thomas, as originally published in Donald Keogh's 1955 book. Given the Condon Panel was working from Edwards' reporting of Smith's badly construed facts of the case, we perhaps cannot blame the Condon Panel too much for failing to find any files on this case, because the case did not actually exist. There were no files to find. But what is perhaps surprising is that there's no mention of the Moore fragment in the report, and they seemingly do not put the 2 cases together, which I personally find a bit odd. It would be easy to conclude that they were just not aware of the Moore sample, but this is actually not the case, because in the Condon Project files on the Moore fragment, they're actually significantly larger than the files they have on this Smith-Knowles piece. In fact, the files they have on the Smith-Knowles piece consisted of the few letters that I've already included in this slideshow. Their file on the Moore piece is actually much more significant. So they did, in fact, know all about Smith and Knowles and the Moore piece, in fact. And Lowe actually corresponded with Alvin Moore on multiple occasions about his stone and UFO theories, and they even considered kind of bringing him on as a consultant to the project, kind of briefly, anyways. Lowe actually had been tipped off about the Moore story by Art Lundahl, and Art Lundahl was the founder of the National Photographic Interpretation Center, and it was basically the CIA's top photo analyst from 1953 until he retired in 1974. Lundahl would meet Moore at this Washington National Reserve meeting in 1953, and they became close friends over a shared interest in the UFO topic. Lundahl was a lifelong UFO buff who was involved in analyzing UFO photographic cases collected by the government. And Moore and Lundahl started talking about UFOs the very first time they met. And eventually, Lundahl was basically impressed with Moore's story of this found object that they had found and thought it could be something extraordinary. So at a second reserve meeting, Moore would show Lundahl a photograph of the stone. And again, these photographs are pretty bad. And Lundahl said that even though he had difficulty making any definitive judgments based on them, he said it seemed to be an alloy of some kind anyways. So 13 years later, when the Condon Project starts up and they're looking for a photo analyst, Lundahl would seem to be the kind of the ideal choice. And he did, in fact, give a briefing to Edward Condon, Robert Lowe, and David Saunders on February 20th, 1967, on the methodology of kind of analyzing photographic cases, or kind of more specifically on using photogrammetric methods and photogrammetry to in the analysis of UFO cases. But ultimately, he turned down being their photo analyst. I guess he had other things, or he didn't want to get involved in that project or whatever. But it was at this meeting that he must have shared Moore's story with the Condon Project. Because, again, if going back to that letter that Lowe wrote to Dr. Thomas Ratchford on December 8th, he mentions this. He says, Lundahl mentioned a patent lawyer in Mississippi named Al Moore, who was thought to have in his possession a report of analysis that was made of a piece of metal discovered after a fall through the atmosphere. And so Lundahl tells them about the story. Moore writes this letter in December that year saying we should follow up on this and see if we can figure anything out. So Lowe decides to get in touch with Moore by telephone, and apparently he tries to get in touch with Moore a couple of times, but Moore's phones are out. And again, Moore has some pretty crazy theories about skymen and electric wave interference messing with his phones and whatnot. But he was eventually able to get a hold of Moore by telephone on January 5th, 1968. Which caused Moore to respond with a letter that afternoon. And Moore is more than happy to support the project in any way possible, including taking off time off work for fair compensation to produce a report for the project on his investigations into these sky stones that he spent, since this first event in 1952, he spent the last, 16 years deep in his sky stone theories and collecting this information. And he offers to write a report for them to include in their final report. And so they briefly exchanged some correspondence, including Moore sends him a copy of the letters and reports that he initially mailed to Ruppelt, as Lowe had sent him a letter saying, we are unable to find your report in the Bluebeck files. And so he sends a copy of all that information. And ultimately, they do find the files are found later in the National Archives. And the Air Force was able to find that handwritten letter as well as that correspondence of the analysis. And they had sent that on to the Air Force as well. But some Moore sends them the letter and all that details for him to check out, as well as some diary entries and whatnot. But ultimately, Lowe finds little reason to involve Moore or his story in the Condon Project's work. And in another letter to Ratchford dated January 17th, he states, I don't think it's going to be terribly useful to follow up with Moore. If you can give me an explanation as to why we should look into the stones and they appear to have any real relation to the UFO phenomenon, then we will follow up with it. And again, some researchers like Zeckel get pretty conspiratorial about why Moore was not included in the Condon report. I think the truth is pretty simple. There is no reason to think it had anything to do with UFOs. even if they could get a hold of that sample or the report, it was already determined to be relatively mundane slag, unconnected to any UFO event. There was no UFO sighting, nothing to really work with, no reason for the Condon Project to engage more with his pet theories on sky stones and sky islands. And perhaps they were being generous, considering the Edward Smith story as a separate event and attempting to verify it that way. Whatever the reason, or perhaps because it was the more popular story and thus more urgent to address, the Smith version ended up in the Condon Project report, and Moore's version doesn't get published, and it mostly vanishes from the UFO literature discourse. Curiously, though, they fail to mention Wilbert Smith or Knowles in their version of events, even though they're quite prominently featured in Edwards' book that they quote. And the Condon Project files explicitly mention Knowles and Smith in the case. In some of the very few couple of letters on Knowles in the Condon Project archives, when they're talking about this case, they specifically mention Knowles and Smith. But Smith and Knowles are known for kind of their wild theories and willingness to believe just about anything, with perhaps not names that they wanted associated with the project. So by leaving those names out, it suggested that they avoided an uncomfortable situation of having to explain why they were paying any heed to cases of people that aren't very credible. And if people don't know, Knowles is actually involved with the famous a contactee called Francis Swan. Francis Swan was a contactee that lived next to Knowles. And if you've ever seen the Ebenezer movie, UFOs, It Has Begun or whatever, there's the case where Robert Friend talks about talking to the AFA and being told to look out the window and they'll see a UFO out there. That's all from Francis Swan. And Francis Swan, the contactee, made a believer out of Knowles. Knowles convinced the Office of Naval Intelligence to send a couple people to talk to Francis Swan. So all these guys are really deep into contacteeism and all this other stuff that is more kind of like the fringe side of ufology. And Knowles actually didn't live too far from Betty and Barney Hill. In fact, when he died, a lot of his books, like Adamski's books and whatnot, actually went to Betty Hill from Knowles' wife. But anyway, so there was actually, in fact, a UFO sighting that did happen in this area on July 23rd, involving some Fairfax County police officers who saw a red object hovering in the sky above Alexandria, Virginia for 10 to 15 minutes before disappearing silently to the west at a high rate of speed. Unfortunately, and you can see in the map here, Alexandria is down there to the southeast of Vienna. And this is all kind of along the path of Washington National to Dulles, where this kind of occurred. But there's no reason, again, to think that this has anything to do with the object, because firstly, there was no UFO object seen, when they found the object. It was just found on the ground. But more importantly, this fragment was collected earlier in the afternoon on the 23rd, so it could not have anything to do with this case that happened at 9 p.m. Later in the day. But Moore, believing his fragment came from the sky during the middle of a flap of sightings around the Washington, D.C. area, albeit days before the alleged event, remember they happened on the 19th and the 20th, assumed without evidence that it must have came from these glowing sky objects as were reported in the news. But there was never really any reason to think that this object came from a UFO, besides for Moore theorizing that the trees got damaged, and so it had to come from the air. Now, what do I believe happened? And this is a theory that I also, I believe I share mostly with researcher Michael Swartz, is this. Moore received a sample from his employer and neighbor, Mr. Lanham. Finding it curious, he investigated the scene and eventually reported the event to the Navy and sent the sample off to the Bureau of Standards for testing. No one there found it particularly interesting and so returned the sample to Moore. Lieutenant Commander Frank Thomas, a Navy man, convinced Moore to write up his story in a report and letter and send that off to Ruppelt and the Air Force. He also gives that report to Kehoe, as he was known to do, and Kehoe later includes that story in his 1955 book. The Air Force had little interest in the slag, having returned it to Moore, but Moore, through his work at the CIA, met a Captain Goodspeed on loan to the CIA from Canada and gave him the sample to take back to Canada, where it ended up in the hands of Wilbert Smith. Now, we cannot say for sure or how and why the shoot down story got glued onto the Moore story by Smith. And perhaps it was added by Smith itself, embellishing inaccurate secondhand information that he received about the sample. But it may have, in fact, been received by trance mediumship. And that may seem a little crazy and out there, but there is actually precedent. Smith, kind of despite being considered a highly credentialed scientist investigating the UFO topic, was essentially more of a contactee who believed he was talking to space people in his head, and less of a nuts and bolts guy. And this would not be the first time, in fact, that they used messages received from a medium to tell the story of a piece of alleged UFO debris. Now, in June 1960, a mysterious 3,000 piece of metal was found on the shores of the St. Lawrence River, roughly 20 miles upstream from Quebec City. And in fact, there was actually two pieces found. There was like an 800-pound piece. The 3,000-pound piece was supposedly found actually more in the river, and it was submerged a lot of the time. And the 800-pound piece was found closer to the shore that you could see it during low tide. So it wasn't exactly on the shore. But so there's this 3,000 piece of metal, and the founder, it gets reported, and the founder of Ottawa's Flying Saucer Club has concluded that because he believes there's thousands of micrometeorites embedded in the surface, the large chunk of metal must have spent some time in space before falling to Earth. He further believes the object metal had been part of a large spaceship who suffered a disaster after entering our solar system. And the man, who is the man who kind of made these kind of conclusions, is none other than Wilbert Smith, former head of Canada's Project Magnet. Because of Smith's kind of status and assumed credibility, a lot of effort was put into testing these samples, and ultimately it had results somewhat similar to the Moore fragment. I mean, it was slag produced from a different kind of steel process, a high manganese steel production process. But this slag was likely produced, they determined, by the Sorel foundry located 50, someplace say 100 miles upstream. And so where do they get this story about the spaceship and it being part of a large ship that came into our solar system? Well, they get it from a medium. And kind of despite strong kind of evidence of the terrestrial nature of the slag, which Smith even ends up admitting is likely explanation, both kind of him and this group continue to proffer up this fantastical story that they obtained through a trance mediumship. So kind of knowing this, we cannot really rule out that's where he kind of obtained the story of a jet shooting at a glowing disc. It's also possible that it's just kind of a natural assumption, kind of more almost gets there because he believes it came from a UFO that was flying over the area that kind of fell off the radar. And so I guess it's not too far of a stretch to think that means it came off a UFO that must have got shot or damaged somehow. However, the story kind of gets added, whether it was through mediumship like we know he did in the past, or him just kind of extrapolating out, embellishing the details on his own, it eventually comes to the attention of Ohio UFO investigators C. Wesley Fitch and George Popovich, who tracked down Knowles and then Smith to get their version of events. Frank Edwards ends up taking the story from Kehoe's book, combining it with the story told by Fitch and Popovich in 1961, and then he publishes that in his 1966 book. The rest is basically history, and people have spent decades investigating the case has kind of become so distorted from the original facts that it's no wonder no one's kind of ever been able to come to any kind of confirmation or conclusion. So kind of unfortunately, there really was not a shoot down event, and there's no reason to believe one ever happened. There was not even a UFO sighting associated with this metal fragment. However, I think there can be little doubt that the Smith and Moore fragments are the same fragments. We know that Smith received the Moore sample taken back to him from Canada by Captain Goodspeed, along with the gelatinous bob that turned into an angel hair-like substance. The description, the makeup of the alleged fragments match almost identically. The story and the people involved match up almost identically. The only difference really is this glued-on aspect of how the object came to end up in this rural farm in Virginia. And that's something we'll likely never know. How does a piece of furnace slag end up in a forest in rural Virginia? But I mean, I doubt it was a UFO that put it there. And it's to believe that these were different cases, you would have to believe that Smith simultaneously received 2 samples from an event that happened at the same time. So 2 UFOs were shot down or something at the same time, and he got 2 samples from the same place, but they're different. But Smith never mentions the second sample. He only mentions the 1 sample. I mean, I think it stretches credibility to believe that they could be different cases. And I think a lot of researchers have kind of opened up and decided that they are in fact the same sample and fragment. And I just want to kind of close with a couple of other details about Moore. And like I said, Moore is a very interesting guy. This whole thing started off his jump into the UFO topic. He ultimately would get his book published in 1979 by Greg Barker's Cesarian Press under the title Mysteries of the Skyman. And again, like I mentioned, that would be republished again in 1977 by Timothy Becker. And in this book, he kind of expounds his theories that are not too different than Charles Fort, actually. He kind of believed that there's these sky islands floating above, and that's where these stones come from. And there's these skymen, and these skymen were mostly good, but they were also there was a nefarious bunch of them, the kind of the demon bunch, the kind of the Darrows, and they were involved in all sorts of nefarious activity, like draining blood from animals and murdering people and all sorts of stuff. And in this book, over these preceding years, like he basically ends up collecting well over 1,000 stones that he believes are from these sky islands. And I'm not exaggerating here. Almost every time this guy finds a rock on the ground, he thinks it's a sky stone. If he finds a piece of trash on the ground in the book, he thinks it's a sky chemical. It's from the sky chemicals from the sky islands. If he finds a line scratched into concrete, he thinks it's from the skymen. So he spends this whole book basically talking about how he's collected thousands of these like pieces of trash and stones and debris that he believes are coming from these sky islands, and that these skymen are spying on him and other people. And it's a pretty out there kind of book. So I would take it with kind of a grain of salt, and it's kind of no wonder why people didn't really want to kind of associate with him with the projects. In fact, James McDonald would call him about this case in May of 1970, and after and again, he's staying in Mississippi, I believe, at the time, and he calls him from a firehouse. And Moore believes this is because McDonald is paranoid about the skymen spying on him, and so he wasn't calling from his hotel and to avoid being bugged by the skymen. But he eventually talks to him, and it wasn't bugged like the time he talked to Lowe on the phone. The phone call was clear, but McDonald doesn't come out with a very good impression of him. He writes a letter right after this to Dick Hall at NICAP, basically stating how Moore is a nut job. He believes in hollow earth and all these other crazy theories, and he's just extremely out there, and he shouldn't be taken seriously, basically. So he's a guy that, if he were to come out today, has some of the most impressive background I've ever seen any so-called UFO people have. I mean, an amazing credentialed background in history, but he was essentially kind of really out there with his theories. And his theory as to why Smith had the wrong story was that it was a CIA or Air Force cover-up of the real facts of how he found the 1 pound sky stone. I don't exactly follow his logic there, because how is creating a story about a jet fighter shooting something down a better cover-up than him finding a stone in the forest that has nothing to do with an event? But that was his theory, that somehow Smith got a bogus story fed to him that was potentially part of a cover-up. But he basically widely recognizes that Smith had his piece of the fragment. So, and this story was, again, briefly mentioned in a distorted version. It shows up in a Project Blue Book status report number 10, where they tell a similar story, only they say it happened on September 12th, where he finds a stone sample and it's sent into Blue Book, and they basically determine it's just common slag from an open hearth furnace. And I'm not sure how they get the details wrong here. This was published shortly after the Cross letter where he analyzed it. So perhaps they're just, sometimes they get the dates wrong because they're looking at the date on a letter or a report, not the date it actually happened. But the story does make kind of a brief mention there as well. Last thing I'll just kind of just end real quick is these are just a couple of patents of his for his airship that he had. And it was a weird airship that didn't fly. It didn't land or do anything horizontally. It always was kind of facing up at an angle, and it would land on its rear end like that and take off from its rear end. And of course, he never built these, but this is just one of his many patents. A lot of his patents have to do with boats and floats and cars that can roll without damage and other kind of weird stuff. But is a very interesting guy. If people don't agree with me that it's pretty clear that the samples are the same and it's the same story, if I didn't explain that well enough that some people come out of this and they don't understand and they don't agree with me, please let me know in the comments and I'll see if I can address what didn't make sense. Because I think at this point it's quite clear it's the same story, it's the same case. It's just Smith bolted on a shoot down story that didn't actually happen to it. And that's that. Thank you for sticking in there for that long presentation. I think I did it in less than an hour and a half. All right. Back to you, Rachel.
If a flying object exists in nature and nobody's around to see it, is it not an unidentified flying object? I mean, say what you will about things people see in the sky, but at least they have been seen. Maybe sometimes they even feel seen. But anyway, if you think about it, any of these UFOs that people see have a much better chance of being identified than all the others that nobody even knows about. What better way to remain unidentified than to avoid being seen in the first place? When it comes to natural phenomena that we don't understand, it strikes me as pretty unlikely that they remain unexplained, because people see them and they are not only very visible in the sky, but also very fantastic and evocative of our own culture's mythos. Instead, it seems the opposite would be the case. I think that any UFOs that remain unidentified do so because they're difficult to spot, they're difficult to document, we don't know what they're supposed to look or act like, and they fly in the face of our closely held expectations. Giant humanoids? What about weird undiscovered types of ionized clouds? Martian airships? What about an explosion of foam from the sea? Giant metal flying saucers from space? What about really weird little bugs from a bog? Let's take earthquake lights as an example. While earthquake lights are controversial and elude explanation, they do seem to exist in some form. Now, I don't think I can prove to you that earthquake lights exist, or if they do, what types there are. I've said it before and I'll say it again. This one's not an expert. But regardless, what we can say of all earthquake lights that do exist is that they are lights in the sky caused by earthquakes. This is because this is how the category of earthquake lights is defined. All lights that are caused by earthquakes are earthquake lights, and nothing else is, by definition. Likewise, UFOs are the category of flying objects that are unidentified by science. At least that's how I tend to define them. Because if we just include anything in the sky that gets unidentified at all, then that could be just about anything. I want to know about the weird stuff. And like UFOs, there could be various different types of earthquake lights with various different physical mechanisms and a wide range of appearances. On the other hand, there might also not be that many types, and the few that exist may be very rare. According to the U.S. Geological Survey's website, quote, phenomena such as sheet lightning, balls of light, streamers, and steady glows reported in association with earthquakes are called earthquake lights, or EQL. Geophysicists differ on the extent to which they think that individual reports of unusual lightning near the time and epicenter of an earthquake actually represent EQL. Some doubt that any of the reports constitute solid evidence for EQL, whereas others think that at least some reports plausibly correspond to EQL. Physics-based hypotheses have been proposed to explain specific classes of EQL reports, such as those in the immediate vicinity of the causative fault at the time of a major earthquake. On the other hand, some reports of EQL have turned out to be associated with electricity arcing from the power lines shaking." Unquote. The way the USGS describes earthquake lights makes it sound to me like they are a legend to science. Scientists do not agree whether earthquake lights exist or what counts as an earthquake light. However, since the 1960s, people have made various photographs and videos of different types of alleged earthquake lights. For example, in April of 2023, a number of people in India posted videos of strange colored light over Delhi right around the same time as a powerful earthquake. But was what they saw really earthquake lights? Perhaps they could have been observing some artificial lights of some kind that just happened to coincide with the earthquake. In 2019, Friedemann Freund presented a new physical explanation for earthquake lights that happen at the same time as earthquakes. He posits these have to do with geophysical mechanisms along sheets of rock called dikes, which create towering light displays as the seismic waves pass over them. Researchers, including Freund, Robert Theriot, John S. Dare, Michael Godhelmet Persinger, and others have for decades investigated the controversial hypothesis that some luminous displays, such as those in UFO reports, are related to seismic activity and underground strain on particular types of rocks. This is associated with a broader hypothesis called tectonic strain theory. It's the controversial theory that many paranormal events, such as nocturnal lights and poltergeist phenomena, are actually caused by electromagnetic and radiation disturbances originating in tectonic strain. This explanation means, among other things, that strange phenomena would not always even involve any earthquakes at all, but simply tectonic strain. In 2014, Freund, Theriot, and Dare, along with Franz Saint Laurent, published a collection of 65 alleged historic earthquake light events dating from 1600 to the time of their work, along with a study positing that these phenomena are generally correlated to specific types of tectonic rift zones and faults. This study was widely reported in science news sources. The collection includes a whole range of different reported appearances and behaviors for earthquake lights, as well as a whole range of time and distance from an earthquake's epicenter. For example, in one case, globes of light were allegedly photographed at Tagish Lake in southern Alaska, some 300 kilometers from an earthquake's epicenter, which was approximately 30 kilometers under the Gulf of Alaska. Shortly after the paper's publication, skeptic Robert Schaefer noted that the Tagish Lake photo was a large distance from the Cross Sound earthquake epicenter, adding that the incident also has no clear date. The photograph and report of these gold light globes were originally investigated by Martin Jasek for the amateur UFO organization centered in British Columbia, UFOBC. Jasek's report was written in 1998, and according to him, the exact date that the globes were actually photographed is not known, except that it was sometime around 1970. In the conclusion to their 2014 study, Theriot et al. Remark, quote, when studied individually, some EQL reports may appear questionable. However, a large number of eyewitness reports from certain areas, coupled with similarities with respect to shapes and colors, globes, flame-like luminosities, etc., for incidences in very different regions of the world, should be taken as evidence that EQL occurrences are real and a widespread phenomenon. Unquote. It's odd that they point out similarities in shapes and colors, despite the fact that in the very same paper they also identify a whole variety of different shapes and colors. I previously noted a similar problem with the analysis given in Wonders in the Sky by Jacques Vallée and Chris Auerbach, a collection of pre-modern reports that resemble modern UFO reports. It's also worth pointing out that there are whole varieties of other luminous displays in the sky which are all known to not be caused by earthquakes, such as auroras and crown flashes that I've talked about previously, not to mention artificial phenomena such as arcs and explosions caused by malfunctioning electrical equipment. These issues, together, along with the dubious inclusion of the Tagish Lake photo, all cause me to question how reliable the 65 cases are overall. They include among these cases a number of sightings that were reported near the time of the New Madrid earthquake of 1811 and 1812. These were a series of multiple earthquakes of very high magnitude in December of 1811 and again in January and February of 1812. The December earthquake was accompanied by a powerful aftershock, as well as numerous other smaller tremors and quakes lasting for days. The major earthquakes, thought to have been around magnitudes of 7 to 8 on the moment magnitude scale, were felt across a vast area of the eastern United States from Pittsburgh to Washington, D.C., including much of the frontier territories and newly formed states along the Mississippi River. It was named after the town of New Madrid, located on the river's bank, in what is today southeastern Missouri. Eyewitness reports from the time describe the Mississippi River instantly sinking huge swaths of land, as well as unexplained bangs and roars, sudden towering spouts of water and minerals from the ground that created sand blows and sand boils, forests instantly being torn asunder, people being swallowed into the ground, sulfur in the air and water, which isn't really that strange, but still noteworthy, I feel, and the list goes on. This event is really a very unique geological event in American history, and it happened to coincide with the Great Comet of 1811, visible for the better part of a year. Aside from just being a long series of fantastic and catastrophic events, the New Madrid earthquakes are surrounded with all sorts of geophysical mysteries, even to this day. Theriot et al. List half a dozen separate earthquake flight incidents that were reported in conjunction with this catastrophe, but it's hard to tell whether these incidents were accurately reported. Here is an account I found from a collection of primary reports written by eyewitnesses, which was compiled by Dr. Nathan Morin for the Center for Earthquake Research and Information at the University of Memphis. The account is by a man named Matthias Speed, who witnessed the December quakes firsthand while traveling the Mississippi River. Unfortunately, Speed himself did not apparently witness any unexplained lights by his own account. The only lights mentioned come from the account of another traveler he encountered in the extended December catastrophe. Nonetheless, here is the portion of Speed's report that recounts the other traveler's experiences. As we passed the point on the left hand below the island, the bank and trees were rapidly falling in. From the state of alarm I was in at this time, I cannot pretend to be correct as to the length or height of the falls, but my impression is that they were about equal to the rapids of the Ohio. As we passed the lower point of the island, looking on the left channel, we thought the falls extended higher up on that side than the right. There was one boat coming down on the same morning I landed. When they came in sight of the falls, the crew were so frightened at the prospect that they abandoned their canoe. 2 were left on the island, and 2 made for the west bank in the canoe. About the time of their landing, they saw that the island was violently convulsed. One of the men on the island threw himself into the river to save himself by swimming. One of the men from shore met him with the canoe and saved him. Now, this man gave such an account of the convulsions in the island that neither of the 3 dared to venture back for the remaining man. The 3 men reached New Madrid by land. The one man remained on the island from Friday morning till Sunday evening, when he was taken off by a canoe sent from a boat coming down. I was several days in company with this man. He stated that during his stay on the island there were frequent eruptions in which sand and stone coal and water were thrown up. The violent agitation of the ground was such at one time as induced him to hold to a tree to support himself. The tree sunk down, and he got wounded in the fall. The fissure was so deep as to put it out of his power to get out at that place. He made his way along the fissure until a sloping side offered him an opportunity of crawling out. He states that frequent lights appeared, that in one instance, after one of the explosions near where he stood, he approached the hole from which the coal and sand had been thrown up, which was now filled with water, and on putting his hand into it found it was warm." Unquote. As detailed as this account is, it's very easy to miss the detail about the lights. Quote, "He states that frequent lights appeared." Unquote. These could easily just be lights from fires on the riverbanks. A more notorious report is this one from a man named John C. Edwards, which is also secondhand. Quote, "I have just seen a gentleman from Knoxville who passed Sunday night with Mr. Nelson at the Warm Springs. From his account, his situation was more terrifying than ours. For several hours previous to the shock, a most tremendous noise was heard from the neighboring mountains. At intervals it was quiet, but would begin with so much violence that each repetition was believed to be the last groan of expiring nature. The shock at that place did but little damage, except to a few huts that were built near the springs for the accommodation of invalids. The fulminating of the mountains was accompanied with flashes of fire seen issuing from their sides. Each flash ended with a snap or a crack, like that which is heard on discharging an electric battery, but 1,000 times as loud. This induced him to believe that the earthquake was caused by the electric fluid. In the morning it was observed that a large stream of warm water, temperature Fahrenheit 142 degrees, issued from a fissure in a rock on the side of the mountain which had been opened the preceding night. While they were examining it, another shock was felt which lasted 2 minutes." Unquote. This account was discussed in great detail in a paper published in the year 2000 by Susan E. Houck, whom Theriot et al. Cite. Houck is a geophysicist researching earthquake hazards for the United States Geological Survey in Pasadena, California. She talks about how there is a second independent version of the Edwards account. In this version, details are clearly exaggerated or made up. And Edwards describes the cause of the whole disaster to actually have been a volcano, though Houck also observes that why someone would have perpetrated this type of hoax is unclear. She contends that the later document was likely forged by someone else besides John Edwards, the true author of the first account. She proposes that what may have happened was that these bright red flashes of fire were not fire at all, but perhaps instead caused by sonoluminescence. This is when water is shaken by very powerful sound waves, so that bubbles inside of it are forced to collapse with such force that they actually produce light. Houck explains that if the salt content of the water is high enough, then the flashes will appear red. She says that Edwards' description is consistent with this, and she also points out that the rest of Edwards' report seems to be consistent with other reports of the December earthquakes. Writes Houck, quote, "Unfortunately, given that the phenomena at Hot Springs may have only been witnessed by 2 individuals, it appears unlikely that any additional information exists to be gleaned from original sources regarding this particular observation. The discussions presented in this paper are, therefore, speculative in nature." Unquote. None of this is to say that there weren't earthquake lights at New Madrid. That reports exist from the time suggests that there may have been. But basically, this account, much like Matthias Speed's account, cannot ever be verified. And much like the Tagish Lake account, these individual accounts are unreliable. What other unreliable reports were used in building the 65 in the earthquake light study by Thoreau et al.? I will definitely be returning to this paper again, specifically with regards to their research into the New Madrid earthquakes. It seems that until there are more observations and better evidence, earthquake lights are much like UFOs. There is no way of knowing for certain what types there are, how they are caused, or how common they are. Do they exist, or are they largely just based on unreliable reports? Personally, I think there's enough evidence to conclude that at least some earthquake lights probably exist, in some physical sense, and if they do exist, then they are literally unexplained aerial phenomena. I suppose that in a sense we humans are much like them in this way, because after all, are we also not in some sense unexplained? Do we also not sometimes go up in the sky? Are we also not phenomena? Hello, hello.
Hello.
And now over to Luis Cayetano to lead us in a discussion of chapters 1 and 2 of The Reliability of UFO Witness Testimony, aka THROWBACK.
So this book is written by, well, it's actually edited by, sorry, it's my, VJ Ballester Olmos and the other, who's the other guy, sorry?
Richard Hayden?
Yep. Edited this volume. Olmos has got his own chapter, actually, which is chapter 1, Memory Games, a False Recall episode. And then chapter 2 is, we'll get onto that in a second, but that's about the, the Phoenix Lights. So chapter 1 kind of deals with false memory, which is an important thing in ufology, an important problem. So he deals with a case in Spain. He was contacted in 2014 by a gentleman who actually now works in the military, but he was relaying a experience he had 20 decades ago. He wasn't sure initially when it happened. Probably he was referring to a case that happened in, I think it was 1993, but it was resolved as a weather balloon, apparently, a colorfully lit weather balloon. And many of the narrative elements in his telling of the story, the witnesses telling, they don't have anything to do with the actual occurrence. And basically, there were no witnesses who corroborated what he saw, what he supposedly saw. And he was 12 years old at the time as well. So many things have changed in his story over time, including the movement of the UFO, the approach of planes from a nearby airbase, which he described them as fighter bombers, but there were actually no fighter bombers at that station, and they wouldn't have been able to get there as quickly as he implies in his story either. Many other problems, including the elevation of the UFOs because he was overlooking the sea from his town in Spain when he saw this, but initially he didn't know like how high above the water they were, but then years later he somehow remembered, and many other problems like that. A really interesting aspect of this is that the witness thought that he was clearly recalling this event when in fact he was demonstrably changing elements of the story, probably unconsciously. But this is almost certainly a case of false memory. And then the second chapter is about the Phoenix Lights, which is known to many people because this is a famous case, the fallibility of human perception and memory. Yep, that's it right there. So that's by Tim Callahan. And obviously the story, most people know it by now. Lots of people saw like a V-shaped UFO blocking out the stars overhead. The UFO had like lights on the leading edge and then some lights, further back. Yeah. And sorry, this happened in 97, not 90. Did I say 96? I meant 97. So this happened in Phoenix, Arizona. Many people saw something, obviously, but again, this has been resolved. We now know that it was almost certainly a National Air National Guard A-10, which is like a ground attack plane, dropping flares. And they winked out one by one, but many people saw them as like a V shape. The videos don't show that. They just show like basically a line of lights and then they're winking out. But nevertheless, many people are adamant that they saw something large, even like a few dozen meters above them, moving slowly. Okay. So how is it possible that you can get this discrepancy in what was clearly the cause and what was reported? Prominent psychologists like Elizabeth Loftus and others have talked about this, well, not this case specifically, but other cases where memory is very faulty and you can actually manipulate people's memories by changing the stimulus. People can fill in details or leave out other details if you get them to focus on something else. So all those sorts of things attest to the fallibility of memory and how it's not like a video recorder. It's more like a story that evolves over time. So memory is actually, and of course in the criminal justice system, in this article, it's noted that hundreds of people have been exonerated by DNA evidence, even though witnesses were adamant that they saw this person committing a crime. And they talk about a few of those cases actually to bring home that message.
They said it was more than 300 people have been exonerated that were convicted on eyewitness testimony that were later exonerated on DNA. And in most of those cases, they had been in prison for 10 to 30 years before they even got out, which is pretty amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, that I always mention that when people rebuke me, when they say, well, we put people away or even on death row because of testimony, eyewitness testimony. Well, first of all, it's demonstrably flawed, and secondly, when possible, even if still poorly, but at least increasingly, the criminal justice system is asking for corroborating evidence from especially DNA, but other tangible forms of evidence to back up the eyewitness, testimony. So, I mean, that argument doesn't work. When people are trying to elevate eyewitness testimonies as sort of, definitive proof. So, Yeah,
even courts now, even courts have started to recognize eyewitness testimony isn't as reliable as it used to be. So it's not as a major player as it used to be, because now that we know more about memory science and how this stuff works, like courts don't put as much into that. But the fact of the matter also is, when people use that analogy, is that at least in cases of courts like murder, you still had physical evidence. You had a dead body. You had a crime that was committed. Like, you didn't put somebody away for murder just based on like me saying, hey, that guy killed someone, but there's no body, there's no murder, there's nothing. Like, there's still evidence.
Otherwise, all of the rap artists would be in jail.
Yeah, exactly.
So, anything to add to that? So I think I just sort of gave a broad brush overview of those 2 chapters, which I highly recommend everybody read. This book itself is over 700 pages long, so it's a bit of a monster, but I've read about a third or so of it so far.
But if you only read a couple chapters at a time, for example, like that Phoenix Lights chapter, it's only like 4 pages or something, 4 or 5 pages. Yeah. Like, to be honest, I literally read it during the show. So it's not that long. And they mentioned some of those studies that Loftus had done, like with a car accident. And I've actually brought up this example, I believe, in the show, and how people will know an accident happened, but as far as the actual details, like the color of the car or like the speed or like these things, like they don't get those details right. And there's actually a video you can find on YouTube. I'll try and find a link and share it on the Discord on Twitter, where they actually show her doing those studies. They show Loftus doing that study with the cars and the accidents, and they get a group of people out and they have the cars hit each other and they do the study. You can actually watch them doing the study. And she also mentions the gorilla, the famous gorilla kind of in a ball game study, which represents inattentional blindness. Like, so when you're really focusing on something, like, for example, if your sports team wears a certain color, like, you're ignoring other stuff going on in the scene. And so a gorilla can be running around the ball game and you completely miss that the guy was there because you're inattentionally blind to it. And it sort of relates to some of these kind of mass epidemics, like these windshield pitting epidemics, where people thought like their windshields were being damaged in like this mass epidemic of like windshields being damaged. But it turns out it was really just like these dents were always in the car. People just never noticed them. And so, like, you can have things that are always there, and because they're always present, you also don't notice them. It's not till somebody brings your attention to it that you actually see that it's actually there. And I've experienced this personally, where, like, I've had a friend blame me for a scratch on his floor. It's like, dude, that's been there for 3 years. I never noticed it before. It's like, what? It's been there for 3 years. What are you talking about? So, yeah, it's really interesting. I'll point out just one more thing about the Phoenix Lights and the V is that I actually kind of discussed how that happened in the episode on the airships, where I used 3 chapters from this very book and talk about how these contour illusions and how, like, when you see lights in the sky, your brain kind of naturally wants to put them into a shape and a formation and decide they're part of some structure. And so you end up believing like it's blocking out things, when it's not blocking out anything. It's just there's nothing there, and it's just lights that any 3 points is a triangle, basically. And your brain, through contour illusions and edge effects and contrast illusions, creates like objects, like dark black objects, out of what's really just a few points of light in the sky. And that's essentially what happened in Phoenix, Arizona. And I'll point out the famous video, that is the flares, is identical to what I had seen personally over Area 51 when they did a flare drop. It looked pretty darn identical to the more recent 29 Palms case. That was just another flare drop. But people have a tendency to see these bright lights and put a structure to them and think it's something more than it really is. So,
yeah, and also the fact that many people probably didn't even know what these flares would look like. They just assume that they would drop. So, like, if you don't know what the proper assumptions are for a phenomenon or a stimulus, you're going to misinterpret that, and your brain's going to go to something else. And elsewhere in the book, actually, not this author, but somebody else, gives a sort of evolutionary psychology type of explanation for UFOs, that humans, when they see something which is kind of out of the ordinary, they will reference that in terms of what they do know. So in this case, it might be spaceships. Like they see something out of the ordinary in their experience, their brain kind of goes to something which is they've encountered before in the media, in this case, because that's what we're living in, is an media information environment.
Yeah, we interpret and frame things kind of in the, the stuff we're used to, the context and like the culture that we come from, which could, like I say, explain why you see people saw airships, around the turn of the century. Then they started to see, metallic kind of craft, it kind of seems to follow the development of our own technology. And because we have a tendency to interpret and see things in that way. So it's, yeah.
Another point that was brought up in the chapter was specifically about Mitch Stanley, who was a witness who specifically actually looked at the lights in Scottsdale through a telescope and said that he saw airplanes. So I think this was, it was. I don't remember the whole timeline of the Phoenix Lights case, but I think that he was seeing at a different vantage and possibly at a little bit of a different time from the main witnesses, what they saw that was videotaped.
Yeah. But yeah, like Louise said, like a lot of people, they don't see how like something like that could form the structures that they see. And you see that a lot also, like even just like Chinese lanterns, people like, well, how can that's like a triangle of lights. How can Chinese lanterns create a formation like that? Like, but the thing is like even with things that are just floating in the wind, like flares or Chinese lanterns, like they do occasionally end up in certain formations. And like I say, any 3 points is a triangle. Like it's not real. That's not really a particular formation per se. And in the case of flares, the way they are dropped as they fly by, they fall down in that kind of like arched pattern as they float down to the ground. Unless there's like obscene winds blowing them in every which weird direction, they kind of do fall in a line like that. That seems like there's some sort of structure there, but that's just how they fall.
Yeah. I also kind of just want to talk a little bit about the introduction because it contains some really interesting stuff in it as well. And the introduction and forward, which I'm confusing now, but they also talk about the possible connection between abduction narratives and sadomasochism, which is really fascinating. And also, they talk about something called alien encounter disorder, which I'm really interested in learning more about this.
How do I get that?
Alien encounter disorder. Yeah, so it importantly differs from sleep paralysis or the common bedtime occurrences of visitation episodes, as it manifests in the waking state at times when the subject is engaged in ordinary activities. I think that's pretty remarkable. So I'm really curious. I'd never heard that phrase before. So I think it might be something that Biaster almost came up with. I'm not sure.
What forms of idiotic behavior, and then so they just like come down here to act a fool and then leave and leave you confused, like why they're doing this crazy nonsense. I mean, that's you got these high strangeness cases, like like the pancake case that like in a way makes no sense whatsoever, like for any form of advanced being to do. So yeah, alien.
Yeah, well, Jacques Vallée's got his explanation for that, which is that they're trying to sort of slot into the idea of ETs, but they're actually interdimensional.
Yeah.
And they're trying to influence our social evolution by doing these seemingly nonsensical things, which actually have got like a higher level meaning to them, like could trigger some sort of behavior or thought in us, which pushes us on a certain trajectory. The meta idea.
This is not all. I mean, in a way, sort of Alvin Moore's kind of theories are in a way similar. He kind of believes these sky men, and I mentioned to you kind of followed the theories of Fort. He kind of thought we were cattle, that we were kind of imprisoned and the cattle of these sky people that, kind of control us. And he believed basically their purpose, I guess, was like influencing us and influencing like our culture and development in various ways. Most of the time it was in good ways, but sometimes they did it in nefarious ways, where they hurt or injured people. And that's what these sky men were doing, is basically influencing and controlling us from their sky islands above the earth. And
it's so fascinating to me that people really are drawn to this idea that, like, all this weird stuff, is explained by some outside intelligent force, like
it's the archons. The archons from the planet Saturn are projecting their thoughts onto us. No. Yeah, it's
I don't mean that in a mean way, I just mean it's just really fascinating to me, because I feel like,
well, and then you have the distortion theory, like Jose, I don't know if I pronounced his name right, Cuervaca, or whatever, his distortion theory, where it's in a way, it sounds sort of like ballets, where there's these things that are kind of controlling or influencing us. But the reason why our experiences are so weird is because we're not really having that experience. That's almost kind of like a distorted dream that's being kind of put in our head that we also kind of create ourselves using our own cultural influences and knowledge and memories. So we kind of create these weird events on our own. And so it's not really what happened. It's just what you remember, almost like kind of like a screen memory. So it's, it's in a way, to me, it seems a little woo. It seems like a way to explain away cases in a way that you can never actually prove. But
I think it might go back to that hyperactive agency thing, but I don't really know, but I just find it interesting because to my mind, which, I don't know, I guess I'm lame. I'm for being skeptical in this particular way, but that to my mind, it seems like any sort of theory like that's going to involve NHI, there's going to be a more parsimonious option there that doesn't involve NHI. Like, for example, with this distortion theory that you were just talking about, it's like, so if you're using your own mind and your own cultural conceptions to create part of this experience, wouldn't it be more parsimonious to say that you created the entire experience?
Yeah, you would think.
I think people can disagree with me, though, if they want.
I think one of the reasons they come up with these theories, though, like valet and whatnot, is because, like I say, these encounters make no sense for advanced extraterrestrial intelligences. So you've got to come up with some other kind of explanation to justify the nonsensical nature of these encounters. And so why not appeal to some abstract, interdimensional or outer worldly force that's not alien, but that is influencing and manipulating us in some way?
Yeah, which if you think about it, though, it's like, so if something is really weird and arbitrary, then maybe, the explanation is just weird and arbitrary. So we don't have to come up with this whole systematic explanation of unseen forces or something, right?
Yeah.
That's just how I see it.
It reminds me of something I was going to mention about the Moore case, or more specifically that St. Lawrence fragment case, the Ottawa big piece of metal. And how it relates to how people and this is a point, I'll give credit to Chris Witowski for making on his blog, about how these UFO debris, everybody in the UFO field is always arguing for the government to analyze them. They want the government to take things seriously. They want them to analyze these UFO debris. But then when the results come back, like with the recent TTSA sample of Art's parts, or any of these other debris, and they come back, mundane terrestrial slag, they refuse to accept those answers from the government. They fought so hard to be taken seriously, but then when the government spends the time, money, and effort to look at something for them, they then refuse to accept those answers. And it's really interesting how he did in this St. Lawrence case, because when they got these results back from CADRA, the Canadian government people that analyze the samples and whatnot, they kind of refused to believe these own scientific results, and that determined it was basic slag. And they come up with this fantastical explanation for it. And their explanation is that, well, in our 3D reality, this material may just be boring slag that makes no sense to us, but we don't understand the 4-dimensional alien science and extending out into the ultimate reality of the third twister quadrature of alien science, whatever nonsense he explains. Like that slag, that garbage in our world could be part of an advanced alien spaceship in this 4-dimensional science of his. And it's like, okay, so why do you even care if they analyze it in the first place? If you're just going to ignore the results and come up with your own loony theory like that can't ever be proven, why do you guys even care if the government analyzes or looks at this stuff?
That sort of got parallels with an aspect of the contactee mythos. Some of them said, for example, that the Nordics, they came from Venus or Saturn.
Yeah.
Right. But then, like when the Venera space probes landed on the surface of Venus, it showed that it was like a, 900-degree Fahrenheit hellscape. Nothing could live on that. And then, then the contactee people say, well, that's just like on our vibrational frequency.
Yeah.
There is actually like a luscious civilization living there. We just can't see it.
Or Valiant Thor comes from Venus, but he lived inside the planet, and it's not actually as hot there. They had all sorts of crazy theories that they can justify why what they believe contradicts the scientific evidence. And like I say, make no mistake, like Wilbert Smith's little group up there in Ottawa was a contactee group. They believed heavily in contacteeism and like mediumship, and that's where they got a lot of the information. They were obsessed with Nikola Tesla and regularly channeled messages from him and put it in, their publication topside. So yeah, it's just weird how even those people will, claim they want investigation, but then when they get it, just appeal to some fantastical theory as to why the scientific results don't match with their version of science.
One other thing from the introduction, this is a little breakdown of the book in terms of where the authors and the papers came from, as well as the fields that the papers are that the authors are from, I believe. So I thought that was pretty interesting, going back to when we were talking about the interdisciplinary nature of studying UFO reports. We've got an entire swath of stuff ranging from various different fields in the humanities, as well as various different more hard science fields like engineering and physics.
Most of them aren't even, most of the people aren't ufologists in this book. They're actually just relevant subject experts in these various areas talking about this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I highly recommend people start to go through this. Like I say, even if you believe something truly phenomenal is happening out there, you need to understand the intricacies of eyewitness testimony, memory issues and perceptual issues and things like that.
They also,
the book is great for that.
Mm-hmm. I agree. They also give a breakdown of what they asked all of the authors, if they believe or if they don't believe, or if they're more kind of agnostic. And most of them definitely landed in the we don't believe camp, but there were also people in the other two categories as well. There were, I believe, 4 authors that said that they actually believe in some sort of existence of UFOs or something like that.
Do they list their names, or is it just a generic stat?
It's just a infographic. I don't have it up.
I want to know who actually believes.
No, it doesn't say.
Okay. Yeah.
Was there anything that you wanted to add, Luis?
Yeah, I would also want to know who believes, because it seems to me that sometimes you can have really kind of skeptical people believing something which is seemingly fantastical. And for like reasons which are reminiscent of faith, like they even admit, like, I don't have evidence, but I still believe, right? So it's like an article of faith. But I'm not saying that these people necessarily are doing that, but I just find that interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't personally just reject faith entirely, personally. Like, and when it comes to, personal beliefs and stuff like that, I think sometimes faith can be functional and useful. It's just it's really easy to cross the line into like kind of toxic faith.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just say I mentioned in the past how like a lot of the researchers I know, a lot of the older veteran researchers, and like even like some of the people involved in this book here, they I would say that they do believe something unusual is happening per se, but that they would be considered skeptics by most of the UFO community because they do take a more critical approach to things. Like I think even Eddie Ballard, who has a chapter or so in this, has been called a skeptic and a debunker on Twitter, and it's like, no, he's just a folklorist. Like it's like his like approach, and like so many people think that if you show an interest in these topics like eyewitness testimony and approaching this topic more critically, that means you just think there's nothing to it, but that's just not really the case. I actually find a lot of the people more involved in this topic tend to be some of the more skeptical people, at least when it comes to a case-by-case basis. They just might perhaps have a wider belief that there's something there that keeps them going. But on a case-by-case basis, they can be just as skeptical as any skeptic you run across. So, and talking about Phoenix Lights, Eddie Ballard, I believe one of his chapters is on the Phoenix Lights, or he mentions the Phoenix Lights in this book. And I believe he mentions he doesn't think it's a UFO case. There's a couple of cases that are famous classic cases that he's said that he doesn't believe have anything to do with UFOs, that aren't UFO cases.
Yeah, but Bullard is kind of a believer though too.
Yeah,
because he, like in Myth and Mystery of UFOs, he talks about that.
Yeah.
But I mean, he's pretty conservative when it comes to belief, but I think he does believe in UFOs.
Yeah. Did they mention in that chapter, I don't quite recall it, some people argue about how Phoenix Lights was actually two separate things. There was the flares, but there was the other event that was at a slightly different time, where they saw the lights going over.
I think they did talk about that a little bit, but like they didn't really go into it. Was a really brief overview of it.
Yeah.
I don't remember.
They also mentioned, by the way, important aspect, how people would often tell their stories months after the event, including this family, and their account really became like an integral, canonical, story within this mythos, and that this kind of starts to coordinate other people's perceptions and memories, and then people sort of integrate their memories into like a collective narrative. So that's something else, which is, to rebuke people who say that when you have multiple witnesses that this means that it must have happened. Well, that's, not true at all. I mean, experimental evidence from clinical psychology brings that out as well. But
there was a kind of a movement that I felt like, not sorry to interrupt you, but it feels almost like there was a movement around the Phoenix Lights. Like you had, what's her name? Lynn Kitai, I believe.
Yeah, Lynn Kitai.
Yeah, who published all this stuff and made that documentary and everything like that. And there's kind of like, I think there was like groups of witnesses like spending time together and stuff like that. Like it almost became like there's almost like a Close Encounters of the Third Kind vibe of this sort of mass movement of people like that were involved in the sighting.
And I talked about this process in the episode where I talked about the UFO reporting cycle and how there's the different steps, the sighting, the report, and how like after time, and if you don't get to people like right after it happened, again, like Louis says, they integrate pieces that they picked up from the news and that they've heard from other people, and many times they don't mean to even do it. It's subconscious, but it gets integrated and reconsolidated, and their memories change. Like, because the memory, it's a constantly changing process. Like I said, it's not a tape recorder where it's just stuck in there and then it never changes. What you remember constantly gets written and rechanged as you integrate new information from external sources, and that's all part of the report process, and why it's so important to get to people as close to when this supposedly happened before it starts to get distorted over time. And many times with those multiple witnesses, like you say, they didn't all come out simultaneously. Like, the story came out and then other people came out. You're like, oh yeah, I think I saw that too. And in many cases, people are just thinking back, like, somebody saw something that night. I saw something that I thought was weird that night. I think I saw the same thing. And all of a sudden they saw the same thing. And what they saw could have just been, a plane or whatever that had nothing to do with even the event. And so, yeah, you got to be very careful. You've got to kind of like timeline out when these witnesses came about and when they were investigated, when they, gave their interviews. And if you look at it, you can even see how it changes, as Jenny Randall did in that article. She saw how that person's story changed from when she first interviewed them after it happened to after they had been interviewed by the media and the UFO group, and how that sighting of Venus turned into a potential abduction and landing next to their house after it had gone through the media and UFO investigators got a hold of them. So you got to be very careful about that kind of stuff, because a lot of what we end up hearing isn't even like the way the story originally was.
Yeah, and Fife Symington, he did that thing where he's like kind of like publicly making fun of it at that press conference, and then he later came out to admit that he also had an experience.
Yeah.
But it's like, if you think about it though, like, because most people would look at that and be like, oh, that makes Fife Symington like more reliable. But in reality though, he's being also affected by this, delayed reporting, right? Like, he could have very easily distorted his own memory of what happened during that period of time,
Or he just decided to jump on the bandwagon for publicity.
That's true. He could have been doing it for political reasons. Yeah, that was the only thing I was going to say. Did you want to add anything, Luis?
Personally, I found that funny when he brought out the alien on the stage. I think it's done. So many people in ufology get so mad about stuff like that. Like, how dare he ridicule the UFO topic? Like, I think people take this too seriously. I think we need to be able to laugh at ourselves. Like, I thought that was kind of funny. Like, I don't care when people do jokes like that. But so many people in this community get so angry when they see stuff like that. They're just ridiculing everything. And it's like, oh, guys, come on. Have a laugh. That's like the John Oliver segment that he recently did earlier this year. Some people will upset with it because, but he's a comedian. He's supposed to be funny. You're supposed to be able to like laugh at yourself and, make jokes with yourself.
Yeah. And I mean, he could have done like, he was so like moderate with that too.
Yeah.
Like, he could have been so much more critical of the disclosure movement, and he totally
wasn't. I thought it was very fair, actually. Yeah. Yeah, so.
All right. Is there anything else anyone wanted to add before I go to the conclusion?
Nope.
Just one thing that V.J. Ballister Olmos himself says in the first chapter, when he studies the case that was brought to him, that there's no such thing anymore as a UFO virgin. When we're thinking about, witnesses who don't know anything about UFOs, they don't exist anymore. Because it's just everywhere. Like, the idea of UFOs, aliens, and all that, it's in movies, books, etc. So we've all been contaminated to an extent.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, I totally agree.
I'm just waiting for the new Gods Must Be Crazy. They need to make a new Gods Must Be Crazy movie, and instead of an airplane, it's a UFO, and all the natives are like, oh yeah, we've seen that before. We watched Close Encounters, a couple years ago.
Mm-hmm. All right. And for our final story tonight, Jeff's goose had a nice bath. Our own Jeff Knox's goose has reportedly been taken to the kiddie pool in his backyard on Friday in an effort to appease the mighty goose. Jeff reported that he refilled the drinking water and washed out the small plastic container to remove the algae, which seems to be growing at a higher rate due to the recent summer heat. After the pool was cleaned and refilled, the goose went in for a bath.
That it did. I blame the Skymen. That algae is a sky chemical problem being caused by the Skymen. I'm telling you.
Before we go, if you enjoy the show, we would like you to please consider subscribing to our channel, UFO Sunset. Please also hit the like button and hit the notification bell icon if you'd like to get notified about upcoming videos. And come and join our cozy and intimate live chat. A great plus for joining the live chat is that you can give us constructive feedback live on the air, especially if we make any factual errors. You can also join our Discord, a temporary link to which can be found in the episode description. Here at Ufos, our political and personal views are not the same, and the work of each of us is independent work. Personal views or positions expressed in individual pieces are not necessarily those of Ufos, who is not a person and has no views, or myself. Please be sure to check out our respective content. I can be found at the Earth YouTube channel. Visit Luis Cayetano's website, ufologyiscorrupt.com. And you can find Jeff Knox's daily posts on history and the science of UFOs on the website that shall not be named, or on Facebook. Jeff Knox spends all of his time studying UFOs, and he doesn't make hardly any money off of it. Please consider visiting his Patreon page and becoming his patron, or contributing to his Ko-Fi. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Luis. Thank you, Sniffless, for joining the chat. Thank you to all of Jeff's patrons and to anyone contributing. I don't know who those people are, but thank you.
Kevin and Bob.
Kevin and Bob? Is it Bob or Ben?
Ben.
Kevin and Ben. Thank you, Kevin and Ben. And thank you, Sniffless. Live long and prosper. It's really nice to see you here. And in the words of the disc, a disc in time may unwind.